going to talk about how to improve mental toughness in athletes. And so this is a question that I get a lot for parents who hire me to work with their athletes, or coaches that bring me in to talk to their athletes. Mental toughness is always a big topic to be considered, and I think really it boils down to we just want athletes to be able to do what we know they can do when we need them to do it, right? And so as a coach, you got to remember, like, your coach is tactically based, right? So your coach wants to be able to put in the X's and O's. They want to be able to put in the choreography to have you do the skills you need to do. And then you need to be the one that applies those skills and be able to execute when we need that to happen, right? So that's the kind of the fair exchange. That's what sport's all about, is that we're going to go out on game day and compete, and you're going to execute your skills to the best of your ability. And we just hope that that's consistent and that you don't get caught up in things that might disrupt that. So for this call today, for this video, I know that I have athletes watching, I know I have parents watching, and I know I have coaches watching. So I'm going to ask the adults watching me to connect the dots, right? Because I may say something to an athlete that's voiced to an athlete. And I want you to be able to kind of piece that together. Also, if you're the athlete, I know if you're an athlete watching me that you're fairly adult, so I want you to also bridge that gap. And because if I say something, I want you to be able to apply it to yourself. So this is going to go, I'm working on a course at athletespecific.com on how to improve mental toughness in athletes. So that should be out in the next few weeks. But you're going to get a really healthy dose of it today. And so you'll probably want to listen to this multiple times. And you probably want to download the audio to this as well, right? So let's start by saying, like, well, what is mental toughness, right? So my definition of mental toughness is the ability to do the thing you need to do at the moment you need to do it, regardless of the environment around you, which is people, places, and things that are going on around you, right? So the ability to do the thing you need to do at the moment you need to do it, regardless of the environment that you're in, okay? That involves the people, the places, and the things that are around you. So a couple understandings I want to start with, okay? The first one is, if an athlete has never done something before, we can't necessarily expect them to do it right now. Okay, so, and again, regardless of environment. So if you take an athlete and you have, let's say I've got a field goal kicker and I need them to kick a 50-yard field goal, but they've never kicked longer than 40 yards before. It's unrealistic for me as the coach to expect the athlete to do it. And I can't then turn around and say, oh, that athlete wasn't mentally tough, because there is a physical component to what athletes do, right? So it seems obvious, but a lot of people forget that, right? A lot of people forget that. So that's understanding number one. Let me just add to that. I have a lot of athletes who are in speed events, skiing, luge, bobsled. These are athletes where making a jump further up the track is now a new. There's timing, there's new physical ability needed. And so this has nothing to do about mental toughness. It has to do about physical ability. So it's really important that we understand that, okay? Understanding number two is that if you've executed a skill before, regardless of environment, okay, the environment that in, the people that are around you, the location, whatever, if you've executed a skill before, you should be able to execute that skill again. Okay. Now, I'm going to get to that in a little bit, talking about kind of neurons and mental wiring and things like that. But the reality is that if you've done a skill once, you should be able to do it again. Okay. Now, understanding number three is that everything's possible with progression. Okay. So if we take an athlete and we take appropriate steps forward, they should be able to improve their skills. And along with that improvement in skills, that improvements in confidence will come along with that. Okay. So understanding number four is an athlete needs to be optimistic about their potential. Okay, they've got to be optimistic about their ability and their ability to improve, because if they're not optimistic, that's really hard to work with as a coach. And I might argue that if an athlete is pessimistic, they're actually doing themselves more harm than good, and we'd probably be better off like parting ways as coach athlete at that point. Okay, so we want the athlete to maintain a level of optimism. Okay, that they can improve, then they can continuously improve. Okay, they might not be able to jump 1,000 miles ahead, but we just want them to know that, hey, if they put in the work and the time and the effort, they're gonna break through this and get to the next level. Okay, that's fair. So those are my first four understandings. Okay, where I differ in my work than what sports psychologists do is a lot of sports psychologists, they will take they'll start to take this discussion about mental toughness and put it towards, they'll start talking about confidence. Okay, and lots of people talk about wanting their athlete to have more confidence, but confidence is a byproduct of past success. It's not necessarily something that you have before your next performance. It's based on past success. And so if an athlete can bridge, and I'm going to talk about this a lot today, is bridging the gap. Okay, the gap between right now and their past experience and how it relates to what they're currently doing, okay? To what they're currently doing, then confidence will be there. But if an athlete can't necessarily bridge the gap between past success and this moment, then confidence is going to wane. Like, because they're just going to go like, well, wait a second, I've never done this before, right? Like if you have an athlete who goes up against a bigger, faster, stronger athlete and they can't relate to maybe a past experience they had, well, that's going to chip away at their confidence a little bit. So talking about confidence and saying that, oh, athletes should be able to maintain their confidence evenly, that's disrespectful, I think, to the athlete, because it doesn't take into consideration this idea that if an athlete can't bridge their past success with the present moment, then we're setting them up for failure, right? So what this brings me to the second point that a lot of sports psychologists will talk about, which is focus, right? And focus is we want athletes to be able to turn off their life and just be focused on the present moment, right? Whatever that is. Now, as adults, I think we'll all agree that's something that's really hard to do. Now, what focus entails, again, in my opinion, is that one, the athlete is enjoying this moment. They're like, as difficult as it may be, that they're enjoying it enough to be like, all right, I want to succeed at this, right? That to me is what focus is. And focus then has an element of just eliminating distractions, right? Eliminating the inputs in your life. Now, we've all experienced moments where when you have focus, time stands still. You can have out of body experiences, which is really cool. But the idea that just, as an athlete, you're just immersed in this moment. We would love for an athlete to have that, but if we don't help an athlete become aware of that or have the tools for it or create an environment that allows that to happen, then we can't focus on focus, right? And so that brings me to the third thing that a lot of sports psychologists will talk about, which is they'll start to focus a lot on skills. They'll say like, oh, well, the athlete lacks the skills to succeed in this moment. And I don't believe that, because, one of the things that happens, I got a phone call last week from a parent of a golfer, right? And this is a very common scenario. Golfer does really well on the practice rounds, but then doesn't do very well in competition rounds. And what they'll focus on is that, oh, his swing is tight and his body's tight and his swing's not as loose. And that, I think, is also unfair, because yes, the swing has the potential to be the same, but we need to give an athlete the tools to have that, to be relaxed enough to compete at that moment, right? So where I think sports psychologists tend to go wrong a little bit here is that they focus too much on skills, they focus too much on focus, and they focus too much on an athlete's confidence or lack thereof. Okay, and they lump that all under mental toughness. Okay, so I want you to understand that athletes. I wrote about this in my book, in An Athlete's Guide to Winning in Sports and Life. That I talk about how like an athlete only has two jobs to do, right? They only have two things to prepare for, right? One is they need to prepare to withstand challenges, and then they need to prepare to take advantage of opportunities. Okay, so what that means is that like when you are competing, you have the challenge of your opponent, and that could be a person or it could be a thing. Like it could be a track or a course, right? Or it could be an opponent. Like you're going, if you're a soccer player and you're fighting for a loose ball, well, you're fighting against that other human being to get that ball. If they have the ball and they're trying to run around you, that's a challenge, right? Can you stop them? Can you get in front of them? Now, taking advantage of opportunities is a little bit more, it can be a little bit more vague. Like, let's say, I'll make it real simple for now, but let's say I use the example of like LeBron James. If LeBron James only played basketball with his right hand and the game only gave him opportunities to go to his left, he wouldn't be the athlete that we know today, right? But because he has the physical abilities to take advantage of that left-handed opportunity or that right-handed opportunity, that's why he's one of the best basketball players in the world. And so the best athletes in the world, regardless of the sport, are able to withstand the most challenges and therefore take advantage of the most opportunities. So that's really, as an athlete, when it comes to being mentally tough, understanding that that's what you're doing every day in practice to prepare for kind of brings it just makes it a little easier to understand. Okay. So, as coaches, we're trying to set up an athlete to succeed, but also we don't do that in a vacuum. An athlete needs to understand, they need to be aware of what it is they're working on in practice today, and they need to apply that. They need to bring that to a situation where what they're doing in practice now relates to what they're going to do on game day. So to use that golfer analogy, the golfer example that I used before, is that, if a golfer's just on the range and they're just smacking balls, and there's no context to that into a competitive environment, well, they're going to have trouble come game day. And people say like, oh, well, he's not mentally tough. That's not true. He just hasn't been prepared to succeed in that environment, right? And so that's part up to the coach, and it's part up to the athlete to understand that that's what we're doing, right? So what do we do? All right, so let me break this down, a couple of things. So one, the athlete needs to be aware. Okay, as I just said, the athlete needs to be aware of what they're doing and what the coaches are doing, right? So this isn't just about acquiring skills. I'm going to explain this a little bit more in a second, but it's about acquiring skills and then applying them in future situations, right? So if your athlete is young and new and they don't have a lot of competitive situations, that's going to be a little bit more difficult. But that's where we break it down into practice. One of the things that I teach athletes in team environments is that like your job is that you break a game down into micro moments, right? So every time there's a ground ball or there's you're taking a shot or whatever your sport may be, you're just trying to win the next moment. And if you do that enough, then you're going to win the game. So one of the stories that I tell my athletes is that when I was an All-American in the sport of field lacrosse, and the attitude I had every day was like, okay, I want to be the best goalie on the field for this particular moment, whether it was practice or it was a game. I believe that if I did that enough, that I would be therefore one of the best goalies. Then if I did that enough, if I was one of the best goalies enough, I would become an All-American, right? So, but to break it down even further, like, well, how could I be the best goalie in this game? Well, I needed to make this next save, right? Because then if I had the most saves, I'd be the best goalie on the field, and so on and so on and so on. So you can relate that to any sport, right? And any position in any sport, whether it's a team sport or an individual sport, right? So we want an athlete to understand that when they're learning skills, okay, that neurons, like, so you're basically creating connections in your brain, right? You've got a signal going from your body up to the brain saying like, okay, this is a skill I need to learn, and this is what happens. And so you're basically wiring neurons in your brain. And so the more you do that and the more consistently you do that, then those neurons that fire together then wire together, right? So they get stronger. Those neurological pathways get stronger. And there's lots of studies on this, which are really cool. There's a very famous one about a bunch of piano players where they took like 3 groups of piano players, and they took the first group and they said, listen, we want you to practice this one drill every day for 2 hours on the piano. They took a second group and they said, we want you to do the same drill, but no piano. And then they took a third group and they said, you guys can do whatever the hell you want. Well, what they found was that the group that had the piano versus the group that didn't have the piano, they had the same you could see the neural pathways in the brain firing just like they were practicing on the piano, which is really it was just kind of fascinating. So we want an athlete to know that when they're doing practice, when they're doing those drills, when coach asks them to do something maybe in a different way, and they struggle with it at first, but over time it gets easier, that we're firing neurons together and we're making those pathways stronger so that then you can apply it come game day, okay? So now what I want you to understand is that where a lot of coaches fail their athletes is they don't make this connection between what they're doing in practice to what they're going to do on the field of play on game day. And so one of the best stories about this is Bill Belichick, who's the coach of the New England Patriots. Right? So I don't necessarily know where he got this originally, but the concept was situational football. So what he would do in practice is he would ask his players, right? Okay, so let's say they're about ready to prepare to do a certain play. He would ask his players like, all right, listen, we're gonna run this in this situation in the game. He would lay it out. You're like, okay, listen, this is what we're gonna do, and why do you think we're gonna do that? And so now what he's doing there is he's getting the athletes to take that drill, that skill they're about to apply, and basically move it into the future, move it to the game day, so that the athlete can then put their mind into that situation in the game. And the Patriots are notorious for practicing in bad weather conditions. For instance, like, if it's going to rain on Sunday, they're going to practice in the rain on Tuesday, right? If it's going to be minus 14, on Sunday on game day, they're gonna be outside practicing that week, preparing for that situation that they need to perform in. And what we fail a lot with younger athletes is we don't do enough. We don't help them enough to understand that. All right, girls. All right, guys. Listen, this is why we're doing this. Is we're practicing today so that when game day comes, and that you're prepared for that. Now, one of the things that we talk about having athletes perform well is we want them to be able to perform in any situation. Okay. Now, this is, a way to explain this is like, we want them to be able to overcome adversity. Well, if an athlete hasn't really been exposed to adversity, then we're asking a lot of them to all of a sudden connect the dots and do it on their own. So let me give you an extreme example. Let's say you've got an athlete going into a game and they're going up against a bigger player who grabs their jersey. Well, what happens if an athlete's never seen that yet? That first game day situation they go into, they're going to get upset. They're going to think that other athlete's like cheating, they're playing bad, or whatever. Helping an athlete to prepare in practice for that potentially is what's going to prepare them to now then overcome that adversity on game day. One of the best ones is when our athletes are in any situation where there's a referee or an umpire or any sort of judge on the competition, putting an athlete in a situation where you are replicating that bad judge or that bad referee or that referee that misses the call, and encouraging your athlete now to work through that, you're going to now help that athlete be able to apply their skills in that environment, right? Which would normally derail an athlete. So at first that's difficult. It doesn't seem like an athlete might not seem like it's necessary, but helping an athlete understand like, okay, yeah, here's a situation that might happen. What are you going to do in that situation? And getting the athlete to think about it in a way that helps them on game day is going to put them in a better situation to then survive that. And because if what happens is if an athlete goes into a situation and doesn't have a good experience there, then we're going to say, well, like, oh, that athlete's not mentally tough. Well, that's not true. The athlete just hasn't experienced that situation in a way that they were able to internalize what's going on, right? And be able to internalize the connection between what they're doing in practice and how it applies on the game day. So we got to be creative there as coaches and as parents to help our athletes succeed. And there's a term that says like, do business as business is being done. And we want our athletes to prepare for that situation on that day. Okay, so that's situational. Applying situational game day situations. That's really important. So that's number 2. Number 3 is apply the Goldilocks approach. Okay, now this is really important for our athletes to understand because we talk about this a lot as adults, as coaches, and in sports development, sports psychology, things like that. We talk about how, all right, athletes at certain stages of development, they should be having situations where they're winning easily. They should have situations where they're competing fairly, and it's kind of an even competition. But then the athlete also has to be put in situations that are too hot, right? Like the Goldilocks approach, the porridge was too hot, it was too cold, it was just right. What do athletes do a lot? Well, they'll just migrate to what's easiest, right? I coach a lot of lacrosse, and we all see it. Like, we see kids coming up in hockey too, soccer, same thing. What do kids do? They all take the easy shot. They take the shot that they're successful with, and they don't challenge themselves. And so they spend thousands of repetitions doing those shots that they're too easy. And then they get into a game, and now they don't have any tools. They don't have any resources to survive and to thrive. But the athletes who take the Goldilocks approach and deliberately push themselves and say, all right, listen, I'm going to take some shots and I'm going to take some experiences that are total beach balls. They're super easy. And then I'm going to do stuff that's a little harder. But then I'm going to push myself into situations that are a little bit outside of my comfort zone. And here's the key. The athlete needs to know that they're probably not going to be successful in that situation. Right? Because if an athlete goes in that situation, doesn't understand this, they go into that situation and they fail, and then they think like, oh, I suck. I'm never going to be any good at this. The internal self-talk is just ridiculous. Right? So we don't want that. We want an athlete to be conscious of like, all right, listen, you're going to push yourself into situations that are too hard, right? And you're probably not going to make it. And that's okay. Right? That's okay. We're going to learn from that. We're going to retool. And from that, mental toughness comes from that, right? Just the awareness. If we don't help prepare our athletes though for those situations and let them know that, hey, you're probably not going to do very well here, then we're doing a bad job as coaches. Okay. Now, another point that I want to make is that nobody really talks about how the brain works, right? Coaches tend to, throw out drills and say, do this and do it better. And, oh, you should try harder. And if it's not working, you should focus more. But nobody talks about what that actually means, what it breaks down to. And I think we're in an age now where our kids, our athletes are at younger ages. They're, because of cell phones and internet, and they're exposed to more adult topics than ever before. I think everybody will agree with me on that. So when it comes to sports and how to be successful at it, I think understanding how your brain works is something that we can probably teach all our athletes. All right. And so one of the things I want to share with you is this. Okay. So when human beings, the human brain has a part of it called the frontal lobe, and it's the thing that makes us human. It's the thing that separates us from lions and apes and tigers and bears, and it's very unique to us. Okay. And so where it comes into play is like, so let's say you see an animal getting chased by another animal, right? So they're in a stressful environment. It's the gazelle being chased by the lion in the Sahara. The gazelle is like, running for its life, and it's only worried about three things. It's worried about their environment, it's worried about their body, and it's worried about time. Right? Like how, so the environment is like, okay, where can I go to get away from this thing? Their body is like, oh my God, it just bit my leg. Am I going to live? Like, how do I get out of this? And time, like how long do I have to run until this lion gives up? Right? Those are three things. So in that moment, it's ridiculously stressful. The gazelle is running the gazelle's brain has released all of these survival chemicals into its system so that it can run faster, get away, all that stuff. But you watch that gazelle like 10 minutes later after it's gotten free and it's fine, right? It's just totally fine. But as humans with a frontal lobe, what we can do is we can relive that stressful environment just like it's happening right now. Okay, so a little test you can try is think of a stressful situation in your life. This is what happens with people with post-traumatic stress disorder. Is what they're doing is they're reliving that moment over and over and over again, and the brain is creating this picture like it's happening right now, and so it's flooding the body with chemicals just like that experience was happening. So as an athlete, that can hurt us, but it can also help us if we know what's going on. Okay, as an athlete, what happens for a lot of our athletes is that they don't make that connection. On game day, it's a more stressful environment. In practice, where there's nothing really, the environment's different, that internal environment isn't indicative. It doesn't replicate what's going to happen on game day. So as athletes, we have to put ourselves in that situation to go like, all right, when there's a crowd around, or, we're in our game day jersey and things are different, or there's judges and things like that. An athlete can put themselves in that situation because we have this frontal lobe. They can put themselves in that future situation like it's going to be, like it's happening right now. And I have a whole course on mental rehearsal inside Mental Performance School for our athletes. But what's really important to understand is that most practice situations don't replicate that enough. And then what happens? The athlete has a good practice, and then they go out on game day. They don't perform nearly as well as they did in practice, and we say, "Oh, she's not mentally tough," and that's dumb. Like that's not true. That's not right, because the athlete can perform the skill. We know that an athlete has the ability to perform that skill, but now the environment, we haven't prepared the athlete to perform that skill in that environment. Now, the reason that I said before, I talked about how we want athletes to be able to perform a skill regardless of the environment, is that when you take an athlete and you take it's usually not the challenge of the skill itself that's the challenge. It's the environment that skill needs to happen in. Right, that's the piece. And we take an athlete many times. Coaches will just take an athlete and they'll do repetitions and repetitions and repetitions, but they'll never help the athlete bridge that gap to put themselves in that situation where, okay, guys, listen, we're going to be skiing this weekend. The winds are going to be up. It's going to be foggy. It's going to be low light. Right? But we're practicing today, and it's clear and bright and sunny. I want you to understand. That this is what you're going into. because that's what's going to help the athlete be mentally tough on game day. Okay, so another thing, just to get everybody to understand, that you share this with your athlete, is that every thought an athlete has, every thought that we have as humans, it releases a chemical, and that chemical, when it goes into the body, creates a feeling. Right? So if you're stressed out and those stress chemicals are going through your body, guess what? You're going to have a chemical rush, and that's going to give you a feeling of stress. And so then you have a bad result, and what happens is now you've wired in that bad result with that feeling of stress. So when an athlete goes out to perform and they're competing, and now all of a sudden they're in a situation that was kind of like that last situation that didn't go very well, what happens? The brain starts to go, oh, I'm remembering that last experience. Oh yeah, you remember how that went? Yeah, it went horrible. Yeah, you remember how we felt then? Yeah, here it comes. And now the athlete is now trying to compete, but their mind is now in the past, right? Their mind is now reliving in the past, and the body is basically sending this signal going like, oh yeah, this is totally how we felt then. I totally feel like this now. What do you think the chance of success are for that athlete in this moment? Not very good. But as human beings, we can override that past event, right? We can override that past event by being optimistic and envisioning a better result. That's also a power we have as human beings. But especially if you're working with young athletes, we need to teach them how that works, or else they're not going to be able to do it. Right. So that's why as I said before, as coaches, we need to help athletes. First, we've got to realize that if an athlete hasn't done something to this point in time, that we can't expect them to, we can't throw them into a more difficult situation and expect them to succeed without preparing them in practice or helping them understand, the Goldilocks approach. Too hard, too easy, just right, that sort of thing. Okay, so we have to be able to piece those things together, right? Because the athletes just don't have the tools. And a lot of athletes, I always saw this in the sport of luge. You could take an athlete and you could move them up the track, and technically they're coming down the track and they're doing fine. And then you move them up a little higher, they're going a little faster, but they've got the skills to come down, and they do it well again, and they move them up the track. And then what happens? Now they have a crash. Right. And because they've got high speeds, now they have a really good crash, like a really good one. Right. And they may get burned and beat up or whatever. And you kind of wish along the way they had little crashes, because they would have higher tolerance as they go up the track. But now they have a big crash. They have this massive flood of negative emotion. And if we're not careful, if we don't help the athlete, they start to relate like, oh, I always crash when I'm going too fast. Right. And so, that's a recipe for disaster. We don't want to be signaling that. Okay. So, the difference, the opposite of mentally tough, is sensitivity. A lot of people think it's fear. It's not. It's, the opposite of being mentally tough is being afraid. It's not. It's just being sensitive. And so, athletes who are mentally tough, coaches are typically mentally tougher because we're adults, right? We just have more life experience. We look at a situation, we're like, oh yeah, you should do that. Go. Come on. What, you can't do that? What's wrong with you? That's one of the downfalls of being mentally tough. And so if you have a team environment, you have kids who are mentally tough, and then you have kids who are mentally sensitive. The kids who are mentally tough tend to look down on the kids who are mentally sensitive. And the kids who are mentally sensitive get a little wary about being bullied by the kids who are mentally tough. And a coach who doesn't understand mentally sensitive versus mentally tough, a coach who is that way can also be very insensitive to that athlete who is sensitive. Does that make sense? Right? So mentally tough coaches and athletes tend to look at athletes who are mentally sensitive and go, why don't you get this? Like, what's wrong with you? Right. And that's not, that's a personality trait. And that's something that a coach needs to understand who they are and what their tendencies are and how that can be applied to an athlete, obviously, who's mentally sensitive. Athletes who are mentally sensitive, however, they are usually more aware of what's going on inside, about how they feel, about their consideration of what they're trying to do, and that can just understanding that alone can make that sensitive athlete tougher, right? But athletes who are mentally sensitive can also be more aware of burning out. They can be aware of they can be rather intuitive and empathetic to those around them, and that's in a team environment. That's awesome. But this is where sometimes when we see young programs, and like this is a great example. Let's say a lot of times the coach has one of the better players on the team, right? I know that's a generality, but just hear me out. So then what happens? Let's say it's a penalty kick in soccer. It's a free kick. And then what ends up happening? The coach says, "Oh, okay, my kid, you take that." And then what do all the other parents on the sideline do? "Oh, he's always picking his kid over my kid." And so, but let's say that kid we know is not as skilled and is mentally sensitive. We are doing that kid a disservice putting them in that situation, because it's not helping that athlete. And this is, so people think, the coach plays favorites, or he's win at all cost. No, he's just, or she is strategically picking a kid who may have more experience being successful in that moment than a kid who doesn't. And that's a smart decision, right? Because what happens if I put that mentally sensitive kid in that situation and they fail? I'm scarring that kid, that athlete. I don't want to do that. And so having better communication before a season or before a practice can really help. Like, hey, all right, listen, if it's, seventh inning and, we're losing by a run, I'm putting in my closer, I'm putting in this guy, and here's why, right? And so just having some proactive conversations, knowing that every athlete is a little different. And if we take that Goldilocks approach and realize that it's a scale, right? So, we need to be aware of that, so that our athletes then go in situations where they can succeed. Because it's wrong to think that an athlete who is mentally tough and an athlete who is mentally sensitive, that if I take that athlete who's mentally sensitive and put them in the same situation, that the sensitive athlete is going to perform at the same level where that mentally tough athlete can perform. But then the question comes up, well, how does that mentally sensitive athlete ever succeed in that moment? Well, we go back to progression and know that with every athlete, their progression is going to be a little bit different. And so what I tell coaches and parents is you got to be patient. You got to be patient, and you've got to be able to put that mentally sensitive athlete in situations where they can succeed. Right? And that's really where they can succeed, not compared to another athlete. Comparison in this mentally tough discussion is horrible. But will that mentally sensitive athlete ever reach the performance of that mentally tough athlete now? I completely believe so. It just comes down to the progression for that athlete. And understanding, especially in team environments, that every athlete has their role, right? Some athletes are going to be louder. It doesn't make them necessarily right, but it makes them, they're going to put themselves in situations. Being mentally tough can lead an athlete to be in a situation of overconfidence, where they put themselves in a situation where they ultimately fail, right? So you got to temper that as well. Mentally sensitive athletes tend to be more creative, and they also are great in team settings, right? An athlete who is mentally sensitive doesn't necessarily want that peak experience, but they're not averse to having it. But if that athlete is not necessarily optimistic, right? We all know the situation where you've taken that kid who all season long, they're not your best kid, they're not your toughest kid, but that's, it's the end of the season, and now that situation comes up, and we can put an athlete let's say it's a penalty kick with, the last game of the year, the season's kind of set, and you take that kid who's never taken a penalty kick all season and you put him in that environment. Well, that environment is different, right? There's not a lot of pressure there. It's no big deal. But we can now put that athlete in a situation where they can succeed. But if we help that athlete wire in that situation enough, that can be a huge stepping stone for them, which is really cool. Okay. So having an athlete to watch their words. Okay. So I usually put in place a rule with my team or my teams where we don't say I can't. If I hear you say I never or I suck or any of that thing, those types of words similar to that, words matter because words create a thought, thoughts create a feeling, right? They create emotion. We got to be really careful about that, okay? And so it's really important that as a coach, as a parent, you watch your words and avoid sarcasm, right? Sarcasm is one where, you think of a situation and someone says something like, oh, you're never going to be any good at that, right? Or, oh, you're totally going to choke. You're going to hit it over the net, right? Or you're going to, or you're going to fall, like whatever. If those thoughts are in your head, then that's going to paint a picture. That's going to paint an emotion, and you're going to get an experience. You're going to get more emotion. It's not good. All right. So we really got to have an athlete watch their words and maintain that optimism because what you say paints a picture. Okay. So listen, mental toughness is complicated. It's not easy. It's a spectrum of thoughts and actions and experiences in different environments. But we can do our best by helping our athletes bridge a gap and have that doing that skill they're doing right now, as mundane as it may feel to them, putting them in a situation mentally where they can now see themselves doing that skill in that environment, because that then is going to give them a chance to paint that skill they're learning in that new in that environment. And that's ultimately, that environment is where we need them to succeed, right? And so when people say like, oh, my athlete's great in practice but horrible in games, it's almost like they're in two different worlds. And and yes, we would love for an athlete to be able to do the skill, without any issue, but environment plays a factor. But because we are humans and because we have a frontal lobe, we can now paint that picture, help that athlete paint that picture so that when they get into that experience, they can have a good result. When you hear, I'll leave you with this. When you hear some of the best athletes in the world, think of like Lionel Messi in soccer, who's from Argentina, and he plays in front of thousands and thousands of people, in front of an audience that's watched by like hundreds of millions of people. And when you ask an athlete like that, how do they do what they do in that situation? They'll often say that they've been thinking about that moment since they were a young boy, right? They could see themselves playing in front of that. Like, I've got a gymnast client, same thing. Ever since she was like 3 years old, she's been watching gymnasts perform at the Olympics in front of all the people and the flash bulbs and the music, and that's part of it. But the athlete that just practices kind of in a bubble and practices, in very like restrictive, environments, like soccer is the worst. We put out all these cones and we want athletes to run, and all of a sudden we want that to transfer to a game. There's no transfer. There's very little transfer because the environment is so sterile, right? It's so sterile. So I hope this helps you today, and I hope this helps you understand better why your athlete may not be doing so well come game day. If you're the athlete and you've listened all the way through, like, holy smokes, big high five and a hug to you, because this is really going to help you. Go out today, go out tomorrow, go out the next day. And when you practice, bridge the gap between what you're doing on the practice field and what you're doing on game day, okay? Paint that picture as vividly as you can, and it's really going to start to transfer, and you're really going to start to see yourself improve, and your results will then improve, okay? So thanks for watching, everybody. I hope this helps, And big high five, big coronavirus hug to your athletes out there. I want to make sure you're all doing great. If you got any questions, you can email me, coachedwards@athletespecific.com. When the course is launched, I hope you guys take advantage and invest in that. But really great stuff today, and I want your athletes to win. All right, take care, guys. Talk to you soon.